Hello, hello. We're live with Merging Minds. Our guest today is Donna Jo Napoli. And Donna Jo Napoli is an award winning American writer of children's and young adult fiction, as well as a linguist. She currently is a professor at Swarthmore College, teaching linguistics in all different forms: music, theater, structure, dance, comparative literature studies. She has also taught linguistics at Smith College, the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, Georgetown University, the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor, the University of Pennsylvania. She was accepted to Harvard University for undergrad education and received both her BS in mathematics and MA PhD in Romance languages. Donna Jo's writing ranges from contemporary fiction to fantasy to historical novels. She also writes mathematical tales, science tales, and mythology anthologies. Finally, she co-directs a project that produces bimodal, bilingual video books for deaf children and their families. Her books have been translated into Bulgarian, Chinese, Danish, Dutch, Farsi, French, German, Greek, Hebrew, Indonesian, Italian, Japanese, Korean, Polish, Brazilian, Portuguese, Spanish, Swiss German, Thai, and Vietnamese. She has a focus on encouraging new writers and on meeting the challenges of literacy, particularly in the areas of mathematics and science, and in all educational matters concerning the deaf. Thank you, Donna. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm fascinated by your background. And can you tell us a little bit about any current projects that you're working on and what's going on your part of the world?
Okay. It's lovely to be here. Thank you. Thank you for that very generous introduction. And I'm really grateful. You kind of did my whole CV, but I'm really grateful that you mentioned my work with producing bimodal, bilingual video books for deaf children. In case there's anybody listening who is involved in raising and educating a deaf child, the RISE website is full of absolutely free, wonderful video books with only deaf signers, bringing a wonderful model of language into your home. We have 33 different countries we work with, 33 different sign languages. And good. Okay. So that was my passion. All right. So you want to know what I'm working on right now? I'm always working on multiple things. You mentioned that I do mythology books. I started out with National Geographic asking me to do Greek mythology book. And it was like being asked if I wanted to do what I'd always wanted to do. So it was very, very exciting. And they were happy with the book. And so we've done others. We've done Egyptian and Norse. And then we moved on to an Arabian Nights story. And we did some tales from the ancient Bible. And we did some magic tales, tales about magic. Right now, I'm working on a book for them on animal stories from around the world. Animal stories are often not really about animals. They're about people, just in the form of animals that the people in that area see. And sometimes they pull in interesting facts about the animals, and sometimes they are based on things that really are very antithetical. Not at all how those animals behave. And especially, of course, the animals talk. But I'm working on that. But I work on many things at once. I find it's easier for me to write something and then put it aside and work on something else, and put it aside and work on something else. And eventually, when I come back to the first thing, I will have a perspective that is almost as though I didn't write it, somebody else did. And I can see it with new eyes, and it helps me to do a much better draft. So that's why I work on multiple things. Right now, what's in front of me is someone in Italy. Actually, she's living in Ireland, but she is an Italian, and she works on gestures, ordinary daily gestures in Italian, but not the gestures that accompany speech. If I'm talking to you, I can move my hands all over the place just to say, Are you interested? I'm involved. Be involved with me. But I can also use gestures that accompany speech that support the speech. Like, I bought this beautiful vase the other day and I've been putting flowers into it of all kinds. And there I am doing a kind of a mime. But I can also just use gestures with no language, no speech accompanying them. Things like you can think of obscene ones. Well, in Italy, there are so many gestures, these gestures that you use without speech, not co-speech gestures. These other things are called emblems. And Italy has tons of emblems. So you can tell somebody that you're hungry, like that, or that you want to get out of there, or all kinds of things. And she was asking me, we got into a conversation of whether there were lots of similarities or not between Italian Sign Language and these emblems. And so we're now working on that right now, looking at it purely from an articulatory point of view, purely from not what do they mean, but how do you form them? What hand shapes do you use? Where do you put them? What's your what's the speed at which you do it? What are the mathematical properties? Do they have to be, if you're using two hands, do they have to be reflexively symmetrical across the mid-sagittal plane that splits the body in two, and whatever? And what else am I working on? Other things that would probably bore you to tears.
No, I mean, I find this all fascinating, and I think what really strikes me, Donna Jo, is you seem to have a very unique background in the sense that there's mathematics, there's linguistics, there's a lot of creative expression, there's bimodal communication, and you're very creative as well. So you're it's interesting. You don't just, it's not that you're just studying this from a theoretical perspective. You're putting this into practice through your work. I guess I have a question. How do you see machines and computers in the middle of all of this?
Yeah. Okay, so that was how your representative originally approached me, asking me what my thoughts were on AI translation. I think that AI translation is a fabulous thing for translation when you need specific information of a just yes no type, a toggle,
Mhm.
3 o'clock versus 1 o'clock, or Paris versus Rome, or something like that. For example, you're in a train station in Italy and your train is due in 2 minutes, and it turns out it's coming in on a different track from what you'd been told. Everybody has to quickly run downstairs and around to the next track. And they'll announce it over a loudspeaker in Italian. But if you are deaf, for example, you don't get that. So there's a group in Europe right now working on this sort of thing. It's called Sign On. There's two organizations called Sign On. So the one I'm talking about is based in Europe, and they're looking at this situation so that they can have an AI, an animation of a signer just giving that kind of information, and there's no problem with it. It's just a wonderful thing. How could you ever be against it? How could you ever find fault with it, as long as there's accuracy of the information that's being given? But then there's whole other things. If you take the Odyssey, for example, which is a book I really don't like. So let's take the Iliad instead. Okay, if you take the Iliad and you look at translations of the Iliad into different languages, you're going to find quite different translations. Okay, so above me on my other screen, I have a book that's written in Italian right now, that is an academic book. If I were to translate that to you very accurately into English, you would not want to read the book. You would find it horrible. Italian sentences in an academic setting are incredibly long, They can be as long as a paragraph, and they are convoluted in a way that's just academic writing in Italy. And if you're an academic, you're used to it and you glean the information, you're fine. But were you to just translate that straight, no one in America would ever read it. Or if they did, they wouldn't understand it. It's really hard to get that information out. So when I translate Italian, which I don't do I'm not a professional translator, but if I have to translate it, somebody sitting beside me and we're both trying to get information out of this, I'll take one sentence and break it down into five. Um, uh, will a machine do that? Will a machine understand that this mode of presenting information is not just language specific, but within that language, particular to the context? Academic publications, newspapers, as opposed to signs on the street, or jokes, or a novel. There's just very America. We are so used to you call it registers of language, okay? And you might use one register of language when you're applying for a job, you're at a job interview, and you might use a very different register when you're talking to your grandmother, and a very different register when you're talking to your child, your 8-year-old child, as opposed to your 15-year-old child, and a different register when you're talking to your husband or your friends or whatever. We have that, but the differences in register in English in America are subtle. They're there, but they're subtle and slight compared to what goes on in Italy. Now, I don't know tons of different languages and tons of different situations, but I do believe that if you go to a country like Japan, you have very distinct registers. And how are machines going to deal with that if they're translating from American English into Japanese or into Italian or the other way? So that's one thing, that the registers, but also time. So let me get back to the Iliad. If you look at translations of the Iliad done in the 1600s in England, and you look at translations of the Iliad done in the 1800s in English, and you look at them done in the 20th, the first century of the 20th century in England, you're going to find that the translations of different people in the same time period have a lot more in common than the translations of different people in the 1800s. That is, we translate according to the time and place that we are in. The idea that that there's only one really true translation is an insane idea. A translation is a creative act, and you are bringing so much of your experience in your culture and your language when you translate. So, I mean, a machine doesn't have experience within a culture and a time, except what's fed to it. And is that experience, or what is it? I don't know. I think that those sorts of things, translations of literature, poetry, yeah, that's a real. I think we're going to need human beings translating things.
Oh, I agree, and I want to emphasize a few points that you made, because I think there some things, I guess, we can put almost in a as categorical, in the sense that, if what I understood from what you said, if you have something that's more about getting information across and driving accessibility with accuracy, that seems to be a clear-cut win as far as using machines, right? You're getting more out of that. But as you move into more contextual, creative territory, those wins tend to dissipate and go away. And I agree with you. I do think, just to contextualize a little bit, I think as far as what gets translated in our world, I would say, if I had to guess, I don't have an exact number, but I would say that what, as far as dollars goes, what really moves the needle is very boring corporate stuff. Typically, that's what gets most translated. So whether it's an instruction manual, or whether it's a support web page, or whether it's legal contract, those are the things that really, require continuous translation, and that are employing hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people across the globe.
I see.
And those are kind of in between, right? They're not necessarily as sophisticated as literary devices such as the Iliad, and at the same time, they're not as simple as the train changing tracks. They're somewhere in the middle. So that's one thing that I want to point out. And the other thing is that, at least the paradigm that we're working on as far as tech goes, is we're trying to create a place where humans can interact with engines in a very, very granular way. And if at some point I can show you what our tech and what we do, but basically we're trying to work with this concept that we call iterative pulverized learning, which is basically, think about authoring alongside a large language model, so that whatever you're typing, whatever you're feeding it, and you talked about the idea of what's in there, what's the context that it's using, you're kind of steering, the human is still steering the context at every given sentence with every given choice. So just as an example, let's say, you know we're talking about Italian, just as an example. My Italian is terrible, but let's say you're translating into Italian, and the machine says "te permettiamo," and you're like, no, 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 that's way too informal. Let's say "vi permettiamo," because it's more formal. You're teaching it a more formal context. It's going to learn from that and then give you more formal suggestions as you go along. And if you steer it back again towards a little bit more informal, it's going to try to find a place where it's agreeing with you. So we're trying to create an alignment between human literary decisions and machines. But
Mhm.
it's difficult because it's something very subtle. When you put this in front of a translator, their first reaction is, well, where is my authorship? Where is my integrity? This is, and translators, in my opinion, have been very, it's a strange profession because it requires so much intellectual capability, so much cultural background, and is relatively underpaid and underappreciated. So they've been already in this, decades kind of underappreciation, especially since, I would say, since the advent of computerization of things. Because before then it was either you had someone, or you had no way of understanding Japanese or any other thing. And now, throughout machine translation in these past decades, the human relevance has always been in check for a long time. So translators have been kind of cornered for a while, and it's very difficult for them to feel like they'll still have relevance in this process. But what I love from your position is just how much you value both the contextualization and the human ability to create and live through language. So I guess my question is, how do you see this as far as like a possibility where it's not like human or machine, but human and machine? Do you think that's something feasible? Is that just utopian? How do you see that?
Yeah, I'm an optimistic person. I think that the need for people to understand each other across languages is just going to get greater and greater, and so you'd like something that would be feasible and relatively well as accurate as possible. So I'm optimistic, but I think your goal of having humans be correcting, checking, going through it over and over again, and the machine learning from it, I think that's a very good goal. I'm sure it will make things better. There are things that will always come up, though, that have to do with accuracy, real accuracy. So if we're talking about corporate translations, like you were saying, which I wasn't thinking of at all, because of the world I live in, I was thinking of literature. There are languages that see spatial relationships differently. This is just one example. Okay, so there are languages of West Africa in which if I take a pair of glasses and I take a pencil and I arrange them this way, I don't know if you can see, the glasses are closer to me than the pencil is. And I say to you, where is the pencil? Now, you might say the pencil is in front of the glasses, or you might say the pencil is behind the glasses. It depends on whether you see the person, you yourself, the glasses, and the pencil all lined up in tandem, or whether you see anything in front of you as though it's facing you. Like if you're standing in front of a house, the house has a front, it has a back. And so you can say that something is behind the house relative to the house, or in front of the house relative to the house. And as far as I know, languages pretty much do that. But when something doesn't have its own front or back, different languages line up, whether you're seeing it in tandem or you're seeing things always as though what's facing you is the front of it because you're the important one. And that kind of difference actually was discovered to be really important for inner city Black children in New York City in the 1990s. There was a carryover from some West African languages that affected the English of these children. And when they took standardized tests, all these children failed on exactly the same issues. But it wasn't that they were failing, it's that the English meant something different to them. And that's the sort of thing where human beings have to be in there. How often does that arise? What do I know? I just happen to know about that because a wonderful friend of mine who was an educational linguist at Barnard was the person who discovered that in the 1990s. And yeah, so yeah, there will always be a need for somebody to look at it afterwards, check it, check what happened. It may save an enormous amount of time to have a machine do it first, but I would want someone to check it. And here's another thing. There was a movie a few years back. For me, a few years could mean 10 years. And in it, there were invaders and there was a girl who was deaf. I don't remember the name of the movie. Anyway, they were very careful to have two really wonderful deaf linguists, academics. One's a linguist, one's an education person. Read the script and make sure that in the scenes where people were signing, they were signing properly. And it's true, the film is very wonderful in that respect. However, at one point in the film, somebody's talking about information that was conveyed in a sign language, and they say, the sign language was American Sign Language, and they say, no, you misunderstood. He said, that person said he, not she. And that's a ridiculous thing for someone to say about American Sign Language, because there is no he, there is no she. You point to a spot that indexes it, you point to it, and I say, Gabriel, and there, and every time I point to that, it doesn't mean he, it means only Gabriel.
Oh,
If
wow.
there's another person like John, I'm going to point to a different point in space. And every time I point here, it's Gabriel. And every time I point there, it's John. So it was, they should have had these experts on sign read their entire script and to catch things like that, but they didn't.
That's a fascinating example because the context, it seems it can never be broad enough, right? If they maybe went through the scene, but they didn't go through the entire script, maybe they could have gone through the script, but maybe there's even a broader context around that and how it plays out in different cultures. It's I definitely find that fascinating. But you touched on something that I really want your thoughts on, which is you're an author, and you mentioned this process where you set works aside for a while until you can look at it with new sets of eyes, almost as if the work were not yours to begin with. And when you, as an author, it seems that you have a great sense, this is going to sound completely redundant, but it seems that you have a great sense of authorship. You really understand that the work is yours to begin with, and ultimately yours. You're signing it. It's what you're putting out into the world. But if you're just checking it, how do you propose, or do you think there is a way, or maybe there's not a way? Do you see a way for people to still feel a sense of authorship if they're just checking? And how do you make this checking become something bigger than just glossing over and saying, yeah, it's good enough?
Wow, I don't know. Certainly when I'm going back to a draft of something, I did write that draft. So it does belong to me. At the same time, I'm seeing it with fresh eyes, but they're still my eyes. Uh, so I don't know. Sometimes though, I can, like, I have a book called North, this little novel, and I wrote it and wrote it and wrote it. It took me 7 years to write that novel because every time I came back to it, I thought it was really wrong. And it wasn't, it took me several years before I finally just decided it had to start in a completely different place and move in a very different way. And then I could harvest a few things here and there from earlier drafts to use on it. But the final draft and the first draft, they didn't have much in common at all, except the characters. So I don't know. I think the idea of authorship, though, is an interesting one because I was talking to students the other day, and they were talking about how people with disabilities, when they are interviewed, often their interview is skewed toward them not as a musician, but as a disabled musician. And their disability is kind of what's making people want to look at their work, as opposed to the fact that it's really good work. And let's just look at it. That you have a disability is an interesting thing in terms of what challenges did you have to arrive at producing this work. But let's talk about the work. And they were saying in these interviews that the people with the disabilities need to take control of the interview and take control of how people see them. And I think that's an illusion. As a writer, when I write something and I put it out into the world, I had certain intentions, but you read it and it's you reading it. Reading is a creative act, just like translating, just like writing. And everybody brings their own views and knowledge about the world and how people behave to their interpretation of what they're reading. And if I think something is a wonderful piece of work and very touching, and you think it's a piece of romantic trash, does that mean I'm wrong and you're right, or you're wrong and I'm right? And I don't think it means either. We just bring different things to it, and you can't control how people are going to see you in an interview. You can't control how the world is going to see anything you produce. So, as an author, give it up. It's an illusion. It's a kind of a, I don't know, it's deceptive in a way. Like, we just try to offer, we lay it out, and some people are allergic to our meal and some people aren't.
I love that, and I definitely resonate with the idea that reading is a very creative act. I do feel, maybe I'm wrong, but I feel that that's being lost in our digitization. I feel most people are reacting to whatever is in front of them as opposed to creatively interpreting it. And I think that's kind of, I guess, at both ends. Now that you raised the question of readership, I question both ends. So let's say, for instance, instead of writing a book, let's say I got a large language model to get you a rough draft of something, of a children's book. But it was based on your ideas. You gave me a few ideas. I fed it into a large language model. Now I gave you a rough draft, quote unquote. Now you're looking at this. Some of it may be pretty good. Some of it you may want to change. How do you take this rough draft that's not produced by you and make it your own? Like, what is that even possible, or would you always feel like, I'm not sure if this is mine anymore?
Yeah. I don't know. I've never been there. It's a little conceit we have to be so proud of ourselves that we've done X or Y or Z. And anything that you produce, chances are it didn't just come out of you. It came out of all the people that you've interacted with. It came out of anyone who helped you. You're not doing fine work because you're brilliant. You're doing fine work because you've had a lot of help, a lot of support somewhere, even if that support was in a negative way. Your response to it helped you to make this whatever you've made it. I certainly wouldn't want to encourage plagiarism. I believe that writing and creating are wonderful things. The whole process is really just good for you. It helps you to figure out what it is you really think and how you really feel about something and what your values are. So these are important things. Yeah, but at the same time, the idea that something is all your creation, I think it's foolish. And in academic work in particular, I think things like the Nobel Prize are a big lie. It isn't that this person came along and has some magnificent idea that came out of their head. It's that someone was working on this here and someone was working on that there, and all these people all around, and it merged and something comes out. And okay, you're the first person whose mouth it came out of, but so what? Why should you get all that credit? Even if you had a different take on it, you couldn't have had that take without responding to what was before. So I really don't like prizes of that sort. But I'm not against individual identities. I just think that we can value collaboration a little more than we do. On the other hand, I'm talking about collaboration with people. Why not collaborate with a machine? An awful lot of collaboration that you need. For example, okay, so here's an example. Here's someplace where I would love to collaborate with a machine. Linguistics used to do a lot of qualitative studies. You could have, 10 people in your study and feel just fine about it. These days, a 10-person study would be considered foolish unless you were setting it up as like a pilot study, or if there were very few people available, like you're looking at the use of negatives in deaf children who are also autistic in a particular context. There might not be that many available people to study, but ordinarily, when you're dealing with a language issue these days, you better be looking at a large quantity of data if you're going to come to some kind of conclusion. Uh, does that mean that today is a better way of looking at linguistics than the old way? I don't know. But I've learned for myself that something that I thought, an Italian friend and I wrote a paper years ago, and we were absolutely sure of the data. And so we just check with a few people here and there. It was so clean. I couldn't tell you. Absolutely. Everybody had to speak this way. And then somebody 20 years later did a statistical study, and it turned out that many of the fine points in our work were true of only 60 something percent of the conversations that they looked at. That was a shocker to me. So I've got a lot more respect for quantitative studies now than I had no knowledge of them before. So now, when I'm looking at data, boy, would I love help from a machine, number one, to help me go through vast amounts of data. Number two, to help me understand whether this statistical test or that statistical test is better. Because I find with my minuscule experience using statistical, when I was a student of math, there was no statistics. We didn't have a statistics department. We did have an applied math department, and it was separate from math, and I had nothing to do with it. I knew nothing about anything that was not absolutely a beautiful system. I knew math in a very airy context. But now, looking at stuff, I get the impression that if you don't know really truly what you're doing, you can use statistics to show almost anything from your data. And that's wrong. That's a mistake. And so I would love to have the help of a machine that could really do that. That would be a machine partner for me.
That makes a lot of sense, and I love so many of the concepts that you bring, and I love how you challenge the concept, the fundamental bedrock of authorship, by emphasizing the greater collective context in which we live in. I think it's really strange in some ways because we live in such an individualized society, a kind of winner takes all mentality in the Nobel Prize, as you mentioned, or in many other ventures. You have the figurehead, but the people that are working to make that figurehead possible, they're getting minimal credit comparatively, in any kind of situation. But I like how you flip that around as well, and understand that, well, maybe as the author, you don't have to do that much to also deserve a lot of credit. So it's interesting how it goes both ways. But you're touching on something that I find super interesting, because I have a 4-year-old who's an avid reader. He loves reading, and I had two other children. I have two other children before him who weren't super as in love with reading books at that age as he is, and he just gets immersed in these universes. Like, he'll read the same book, he'll become the characters. It's a very rich experience for him. It's a very, and exactly as you mentioned, like, for there it becomes very clear how reading is such a creative experience. And with children's books, what I find fascinating is that I always I, growing up, I guess I typically, I valued complexity, and I scoffed at simplicity. So let's say, well, children's book, that's super easy. Anybody can write a children's book. Those are short sentences, easy to write. And as I developed and matured as a person, I began to see the incredible challenge that it is to actually make something simple and beautiful, and the layers that go into that. And as I read these books with my son, I'm like jaw dropped at some of the level. Like, you read the sentences themselves, yeah, they're super simple sentences, but the messaging behind it, the emotions, and how it communicates, and how it's able to resonate with a little 4-year-old. So I guess what would love to know from you, it's like, how do you see this process of embedding so much richness in apparent simplicity? Like, what's going on there from a writing process or creative process perspective when you do it?
Wow. I find I write for teeny weeny children up through high school. Actually, I write adult books too, but I haven't been able to sell any. So if anybody's listening and they want really uh, underside twisted, wacky, fantastical, very gritty type adult books, I would love to send you a manuscript. Um, I work on adult work that's very different from my children's work. But anyway, so I write for all these ages. And the thing I find most challenging is picture books, which is interesting because everybody and their aunt thinks that they can write a children's book. As you were saying, anybody can do it is a common attitude. And people write things, and their children do something. They write about it. They think they've got a story, and it's true. Your children are fascinating to you. Nobody else wants to read about your children. You've got to have a story. And yeah, so how do you do it? I don't do it. What I do is, if a story is forming in my head, I just write it the best way I can as a first draft. And then I ask myself, who cares about this? You know, if it's a story about an animal dying and having to deal with it, it could be for any age child. It could be for adults. If it's a story about fear of going to school, your first day of school, well, then you know exactly who it's for. If it's a true love for your whole life story, it could be middle school. You don't make assumptions about what 12-year-olds can experience emotionally. Things can happen very young. I'm not saying I was in love at 12, but I got married at 20, and I'm still married more than 55 years later. So this is the love of my life. We are, whatever. Different stories are, some may be for any age, some may be for particular ages. If I think the person who's going to respond to it most, who's going to walk away from it with something that they can use in their life, in figuring out what their identity is, how they want to face the world, and I know that that's a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old or whatever, then when I rewrite, I will rewrite thinking about that person. The thing about picture books is that they're actually called picture books. Those things that normally we sit down and share together with our little ones. If you take 8 sheets of paper, fold them in half, you will have 32 sides, and that's a standard picture book. And the front page is title and whatever, and the last page might be information about copyright. So maybe you've got 30 pages to work with, but that's all you've got to work with. And in there, if you're writing for, and picture books can be for as old as 3rd grade, maybe even 4th grade classrooms have picture books on the shelves. And of course, there are some 64-page picture books. There are some 48-page. There are ones of different length. But if you're writing, I'm talking to you, the audience, if you're writing and this is your first book, don't try to ask a publishing house to recognize something that's not recognizable. Give them what fits in a 32-page picture book. And you have to remember that a picture book is called a picture book because it's got pictures. So you are writing the story, but the pictures are giving the world of the story. And your words should never be redundant of what the pictures give. And they should never steal from the pictures. You want the pictures to glow and matter to the child as much as the words matter. It's a concert. There are some writers who are also illustrators, but most of our picture books come out of a concert of writer and illustrator, and they don't generally work together. Usually the writer writes the words, the publishing house either says, throw this away, or I'm going to work with it. They'll find an illustrator who wants to do it. And then the illustrator stays over here and the writer stays over there, and they do not talk to each other. A practical reason why is that writers often yell at illustrators and say, you misunderstood me, you made something cartoony when it was supposed to be sensitive and subtle and blah, blah, blah. But a theoretical reason that I believe in is that if the illustrator is working only from the words, then you have at least two interpretations of those words that you're presenting to the reader. The interpretation of the writer, if you can see it, and the interpretation of the illustrator, if you can see it, which makes a richer book. And the illustrator is working just off those words, not off of what's in the writer's head. The writer may think, I've got this, I put it down on paper. Not true. You've got this, and you've put something on paper. Maybe it was what was in your head, and maybe it's not, because it's open to so many interpretations. So just relax. Let the illustrator do their job, and they do their job. And so the writing becomes sort of minimalist, which doesn't mean, though, that it's itty bitty or nothing. Often people will say to me, oh, you write children's books? That must be fun. And I really, when we were talking about gestures before and how some of them can be obscene, I would certainly like to make obscene gestures to those people. It's not fun. It's hard work, and I toil over it. But generally, I try to be socialized, and I keep my hands folded if I have to. Yeah, so I like to compare writing a picture book to writing a poem. I write a lot of poems. Some have been here or there, and many are not. I write poems when I'm very emotionally crazy. Somebody that I love dies, or I find out that somebody that I love has done something terrible, or something terrible has been done to her, or whatever, or I have to make a decision I don't want to make. Um, I'll write a poem. And, I read a lot of poetry. And when you read a poem, you realize how much isn't said in the words that you're understanding just by the phrasing of it. That's how a picture book is, except unlike a poem, a picture book also has to tell a story. A poem doesn't have to tell a story. It can just tell a moment. It can just be a snapshot. A picture book has to be many snapshots. They have to start somewhere, have an issue, and conclude somewhere. So I think writing picture books is enormously difficult. Now, does that have anything to do with where we started?
I think it has everything to do with where we started, because first there's a big parallel in the sense that people underappreciate the complexity of picture books, in my opinion, just like they underappreciate the complexity of translating. Anybody that's basically a translation, sure. Anybody who speaks two languages can translate, and it's the same thing. Anybody who can write simple sentences can write a children's book. It's not true for both, right? And I just loved how you described poetry through all of the unwritten words that are speaking to the reader. And that's just, I think there are a few different themes that I've heard throughout our conversation that are very important, I think, which is the contextualization and the iteration. And I think that those two things are tied together in the sense that since writing is an iterative process and you keep going back and back to it, and every time you go back to it, you can try to connect it to a different kind of reader. You'll never be able to connect it to every kind of reader, but with every iteration, you can be like, oh wow, this is going to sound really terrible for someone in this group or in that group, or it's not going to resonate. And it's a never ending process. And I think, to me, that's hopeful in the sense that even if, let's say, a machine can do a first draft, the first draft is not the end. You have continuous iterations on content, and that same content can go in different directions. I think that's something that before, like let's say you could publish a children's book for maybe, you would have to arrive at a final copy, and that copy would have to be published and shipped. But I think we're moving into a world where maybe you could have 10 different versions of that same book, and each of those versions could connect with different types of people differently. For instance, that's a hopeful, I guess, perspective on the fact that content can bloom continuously through this process. So I think it's all very intimately tied together, and I just wonder, in your experience, what can be done or should be done so that people can have a deeper appreciation for this beauty in language.
You ask really hard questions. You're a philosopher. I'm not a philosopher. I am just a writer. And often when people will say, I had someone do a master's thesis on some of my novels at one point. And she said to me, you've got this recurring theme of X. I have a recurring theme of X. I got a recurring theme of X. Like it's like, what do you know about what you've written? But the thing is, the more you write, the kind of richer it is, and it's also just the whole process. I think it's lovely to get involved just in the process. We're too end point oriented. I'm a gardener. I think gardening is very good for the soul because some plants will do what you tell them, but other plants are like, oh boy, I can't remember the name of them. You put them in one place, and 2 years later, they show up somewhere else. I can't. I love them too. They're beautiful, and everybody knows them. I just can't remember. Whatever. You have to kind of let yourself accept whatever is good, and what's bad. Well, if you can't change it, at least don't contribute to it. I don't know if this how this pertains to having a first draft put in front of you and then you work with it. I fear some things about that. I fear that if you have a first draft put in front of you, if you say, this is what I want to address, and this is how I'd like to conclude, and you let something give it to you, you need experience to understand how to revise things. It's like me with my novel North. I went through so many drafts before I finally realized this was junk. But sometimes you have to vomit before you can produce something decent. But I finally did give that up and work with something that worked, or I think it worked. If you've got something in front of you and you treat this as these are the bare bones and I need to put flesh on it. Yes, you can put flesh on it in so many different ways, but maybe those weren't the right bones to start with. And that's a fear. I think that the bones are more likely to be right on something about corporate translations or talking about. I think they're far less likely to be right about doing an assignment for your class at a university, because what you've done by taking the bones from someone else is deprive yourself of the opportunity of figuring out what bones you want. Maybe the character that you would have produced would have had 5 arms instead of 2. I don't know.
No, I agree, and I think I don't also have necessarily good answers. I have a lot of questions about what happens when you start borrowing more from others, in this case a machine, and when this become, at what point do you stop learning, for instance? At what point do you stop authoring? At what point do you stop having agency in this process? And I don't know. I do agree with you, though. I agree in that there is immense richness in the creative writing process and in the learning process, and maybe exactly as you mentioned, maybe if you do have 22 decades of experience and you're looking at something and you've gone through the process of creating those bones yourself for so many years, maybe then you can deconstruct it and make it yours. But if you haven't, then you're never really developing that cognitive muscle. So but I definitely I learned so much, Donna Jo, from our conversation. I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I loved so many, and I think most importantly for me, you really illustrated the profound, overlooked complexity in language, and I think most people typically they don't stop to appreciate that, and I am very grateful for everything that I've been able to learn today.
Well, you're very kind and generous, and I am grateful to you. This was fun. I had no idea where this would go.
Neither did I. I guess that's what makes it so much fun. But thank you so much, Donna Jo, for being here with us. And if anybody wants to reach out to you, learn more about your work, where can people go?
They can email me. I have a writer website, donnajonapoli.com. I have a linguist website, which is on the Swarthmore College. Go to Department of Linguistics and you will find me.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for listening. This was Gabriel Fairman and Donna Jo at Merging Minds. Till next time.
Bye-bye.